to January 2023's edition of Poets in Conversation. In fact, our 2-year anniversary program. So welcome to everyone who's been a part of the show over the years, and a hearty welcome to our guests tonight, Maya C. Popa and John Keene. Welcome to both of you. So how's it been entering 2023? Are you feeling hopeful? Are you feeling tentative? How are you feeling just about the pulse of the moment?
I'll let you answer first, John.
So I guess let me just say this, I always feel hopeful with the turn of each new year. As you know, is always the case. All the crises from and the challenges and issues from the prior year carry over. But of course, I always am hopeful. And poetry is one of those things that I think always helps give me hope, right? And it returns me to the source of language, right? To the language in its most elemental and powerful form. So I try to always, particularly at the beginning of the year, start out by reading poems every day to kind of fortify myself and to give me a sort of a sense of possibility.
How about you, Maya?
I'm firmly on the side of hope too. I think for me, a big turning point is the winter solstice. Like when I know we're moving back towards the light, I tend to feel better. It's that sort of creeping to the shortest day of the year that I dread. So now I feel like, again, we're tipping towards spring, and that, for me is everything. Though I'm a winter baby technically, but I'm always like, okay, let's get this part over with so we can get to the renewal bit. So I'm just holding out for spring.
Although it's so interesting because it's going to come up when we talk about your book, how spring is this source of, it's a threshold, but also a kind of eternity on its own. But we'll get to that. Well, I think everyone who's watching, I always say this because I feel so excited about the guests, but I think for sure everyone watching probably knows you both in your work. But I just want to take a moment to honor both of your contributions to poetry by reading brief bios here. I'm going to start with Maya. Maya C. Popa is the author of American Faith. Gosh, you guys have so many books. I have a big stack over here. American Faith, recipient of the 2020 North American Book Prize. Her poems have appeared in The Nation, Poetry, and the Paris Review, among other publications. She's the Poetry Reviews editor at Publishers Weekly and recently earned her PhD to become Dr. Popa. Welcome, Dr. Popa. Of Wound is the Origin of Wonder, Hanif Abdurraqib says, I am now, as always, thankful for poems that balance the fullness of the human experience. And Kaveh Akbar notes that Popa insists upon, if not hope exactly, then a world beyond the hopelessness this one inspires. And he quotes you, there are still things that cannot be imagined. So welcome, Maya, and congratulations on the new book.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
This is what it looks like to everyone, though I took the beautiful dust jacket off, so that's not very helpful, but it's a beautiful muted cover, and we're going to have a chance to talk about both beautiful covers, too, in a second. Welcome also to John Keene, writer, translator, professor, and artist, MacArthur Fellow, member of the storied Darkroom Writers Collective, graduate fellow of the Cave Canem Writers Workshops. John is the author of prose collections, annotations, and counter-narratives, as well as the poetry collection Seismosis. John is the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the Wyndham Campbell Prize, the Whiting Foundation Prize, the Republic of Consciousness Prize, and the American Book Award. Of Punks, his most recent poetry collection, winner of the Tom Gunn Award, the Lambda Literary Award, and the National Book Award. Ken Chen calls it a social history of desire, and Tayimba Jess says, Keene's masterfully inventive inquiry of self and history is queered, blackened, and joyously thick with multitudes of voice and valence. Amen to this exploration. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure to have you both here. And I don't usually ask this because I feel like it's such a straightforward and softball, superficial question. And yet here I go. I think, John, actually, if memory serves, it was either in an interview or it was in your acceptance speech, which I watched online for the National Book Award. You mentioned the cover of the book specifically. So I wanted to ask you both about your covers. And I'll start with you, John, since you made reference to it, specifically the photo that you said. By the way, I want to point out, I bought this book, as John knows, because I was writing about it over the summer many, many times, lent my copy to someone. This week, tried to get a copy, sold out in every bookstore in Boston. I had to call a local library, shout out to the Newton Library, and say, can you please process the one you have been processing? Because I need it for this interview. So anyhow, this is the beautiful book. John, could you tell us a little bit about the cover and how you chose it?
Yes. Well, so first of all, let me just say I'm very happy that you went to the library and that they had a copy of the book. That always, it's so important to me that we support libraries and and utilize them, right? Support them in every way possible because they are to talk about things carrying over into the new year. The threat against libraries is ongoing one. I know because I would have sent you a copy of the book if I'd known. The cover is by the late Black gay photographer Alvin Baltrop. He lived in New York and photographed queer life and New York itself, just the richness of New York. I think in the 60s, probably it might have even begun in the late 50s, but definitely the 60s and 70s into the 80s. And he did not receive like so many, did not receive the acclaim that he really deserved until I think fairly late in his life. And now, of course, he's no longer with us. But people have begun to recognize how valuable his work is, especially in the sense that it captures really a world that's gone. And so on a number of levels, the image spoke to me, but his work in general speaks to me. So I want to sing the praises of Alvin Baltrop. And if there's an Alvin Baltrop exhibit coming to a museum or educational institution near you, please go see it because his work is absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much. And Maya, how about you? As I said, I took my dust jacket off. Maybe you'd be willing, or John would be willing to hold up your book so we can hear about the cover.
There's the owl. John, I love learning about that cover. I also just wanted to say it's a beautiful cover. It's just lovely, and that photo is so well chosen for what's inside of it. It just complements it beautifully. This owl. So there's a poem. There's a sort of titular poem. One of the poems in the book sort of involves an owl making its way, and it's used as a metaphor for various things, including the dynamics between two people. And I seem to continuously return to birds as for that purpose, really as a metaphor for other things. And so, I'll be honest, it was one of the sort of suggestions that the art department put forth. But I will say that they had suggested a sort of tiny, very kind of static taxidermied illustration. And I sort of insisted on finding something with more movement that felt a little, ineffable. So I kind of like the feathers fade into the gradient of the background. And as many I'm sure I've experienced, you don't sometimes know exactly what you want the cover to be, but the moment you've seen it, right? That's right. So it did feel by that point, right? There were a number of other owls in the running, and I do wish to acknowledge them. One was sort of menacing, and I felt that was not right. One looked a little sleepy, and that one wasn't right. So this owl, this was the right owl, and I'm quite pleased with it. Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, we're not deep into the conversation yet, but because it's come up, I'm wondering if you would kick us off with a reading of one of my favorite poems from the collection, which is The Owl.
Sure. I'm so glad. It'd be quite a shame if it were the weakest poem in the book, and it was, right there, front and center, but I'd be delighted to. So again, just to preface it briefly, it is a poem thinking about, the physicality of owls. They are tremendously fascinating creatures. They fly without making any noise, which is kind of unusual, right? So they don't bat their wings. They've done numerous studies on this. They are, as all creatures in the animal world are, distinctively wondrous. It is just one whose wonder is kind of immediately apparent. They do all kinds of things. So I'm always deeply interested in animals and read a great deal about them. So there are facts about the owl that are kind of interspersed throughout, thinking of what this owl represents to these individuals, and then sort of negotiating the idea of using anything metaphorically. So that all kind of plays into the zeitgeist or mood of the poem. The owl took off from the field again, away from you and back in my direction. We share an owl now, we did not mean for this to happen. It hovers between us, a symbol and debt, sleeps in a country neither recognizes until we're face to face. Then it's familiar and it's impossible not to laugh. Of course, there's an owl. You're the owl in the belfry set off by noon bells. I'm the owl circling the wounded land. Among the difficulties of caring for something metaphorical is the guarantee it will one day become something else. And it's hard to say for certain when the transformation's final. How you woke one morning at a job you hated, in a mind you'd wrestled into gentleness, and nothing made sense except the way I listened. You burned for me. The owl was a candle by whose flame I could see my own value clearly. The second chance, my double life tiptoed watchfully around. The feeling only a wild bird knows, whose head turns 270 degrees, silent in flight and blends with its setting, whose talons can withstand any sort of landing. That, a necklace wonder, strips ligament from flesh. Something so polite about enduring its violence and hoping only to remain in favor. Watch the bones assemble in the shape of a vole. There are ways to fail an owl, for metaphor to fail. I remember you, the dusk we wrought by listening, the long hunt we made of night.
Wow. Wow.
Thanks. Thank you, Alison, for asking for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I was really struck by the moment in the poem that speaks to, I have it written down, but the slipperiness of metaphor and how functional and valuable it is, but also how potentially temporary, the action is. Something that is changeable can change in another way. And I wanted to talk a little bit about that in terms of both of your books. Maya, I think A Wound is the Origin of Wonder feels in some ways even more like an inner room than American Faith. And John, I found Punks, and I know I'm not alone in this, found Punks incredibly intimate in terms of detailing particular people I imagine are real people. And, the sort of personal disclosures in the book are notable. So I wanted to ask you both kind of maybe a little bit of an abstract question, but what you think about personal disclosure relative to offering a broader commentary about, the world, what loss, what we live in. So maybe I'll start with you, John, because there is such a litany of lives that intersects your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll say one thing I always try to keep in mind is that there is a difference between the poet's life or the writer's life, and of course what might be clearly kind of autobiographical background or elements, foundation, and the poetic voice, the actual poem itself. So there is a gap there, a distance there, sometimes very small, sometimes broad. One of the things I was trying to think about with Punks was, as I was assembling the poems, of course, they were very intimate. They were clearly based on my own life, but then poems that actually are much more broad in scope. So, for example, both the first poem and the last poem, the first poem, Poetry, is just a few lines, and it's a commentary on, poetry and cursing. The last poem, Beatitude, is a play, of course, on the actual Beatitudes from the Bible. So there's a kind of religious resonance there, but it's a broader poem about love and society and everything else. So I wanted to be able to think about zooming in and zooming out, and of course, some poets stay within different ranges. But I think it's always a challenge, when you're writing about your own life, whether it's poetry, fiction, nonfiction, drama, whatever form you're writing in, to screenplays, to sort of think ethically about how you are presenting people what stories you're telling, how you're telling the stories, and why you're sharing these aspects of your life. So I think that as I was writing Punks, or as I've been writing the poems in Punks and then putting it together, one of the things I really was thinking about was how I could kind of move between the very things that were very sort of close to me personally, but also to give a more expansive view of the world and of the times in which these poems kind of came into being.
And before we turn to you, Maya, how does it feel, John, that Punks has been so warmly received by so many different people?
I'm kind of amazed. I really am. It's a small. The Song Cave is a small press. I was hoping people would buy the book. It's like it's poetry. It's not fiction. It's not nonfiction. It's not a memoir. So I was hoping people would buy it, and it's been received very, very well. And the thing that's really been so heartening to me is to see uh, people that I didn't expect would pick up the book and respond to it positively. I have posted online, "Oh, I love this book," or even if it's a few poems in the book, this poem really spoke to me. Or one person was talking about grieving, a huge loss, and there were lines in one of the poems that they said, spoke to them just profoundly. It resonated. So that's I think I was saying earlier about the power of poetry, but also as the writer, as the poet, this is one of the things that you hope happens, right? More than anything else, beyond awards or anything else, that the poems speak to people, even if it's other, just other poets, right? Other poets say, look, I like this poem, and vice versa. This is how I always feel when it comes to poetry.
Other poets can be the hardest nut to crack.
Right.
They're like, I can do that. Who knows? How about you, Maya? What do you think about the relationship between personal or intimate or autobiographical or personally imagined
Yeah.
disclosures and then a kind of broader resonance?
Sure. And it touches so much on something that is so powerful about John's work, and that he happens to just have mentioned with this, which is this idea that something resonates and transcends, the individual experience and becomes in some ways universal. And that's, I think, I love what you said about, working with a small press and then seeing the wide impact of this book. In some ways, it really shows the merit. I mean, that book hooks you in from the very beginning. And I think, I always think of that Keats phrase, we're suspicious of work that has too palpable a design upon the reader. You can tell when an individual experience has in some ways been so made so luminous and so lucid and so clear that it now speaks to a collective, right? And I think in some ways that's part of what I try to keep in mind. I mean, a lot, as John said so well, much of this begins in personal experience and personal reckoning, or personal questioning of things. And I do think that's sort of a generative place for poetry anyway. I'm very interested in the role of wonder in poetry, and wonder is inherently an impulse to question and to try to unearth, right? So, but I'm also reminded of, May Sarton said, the deeper we get into the personal, the more we achieve the universal, right? If we can see one thing really, really clearly, then we have a better chance of connecting more broadly. So I think that's where a lot of the work of refinement goes in. Like, it's sometimes I'll be moved maybe to draft a poem that by the end doesn't feel like one I need to share. It's a poem I wrote because I needed to write a poem, but is it then necessarily something that will end up being, and not of use, because it's not a question of utility. It's a question of, again, will it communicate as effectively beyond itself? What is it that I'm even writing about beneath the ostensible subject? Because you often know the trigger for what you're writing, but what is sort of left mysterious to you is often what makes the most impact to others in some interesting way. So it's both about, yes, sort of like the personal and the public, and also the relationship between knowing and not knowing, I think, is also essential to the poem.
Well, I do have a question related to that. In fact, I found the books remarkable in many ways, but I did feel that there was a very rigorous earnest inquiry in both of them, that these weren't performances of emotions, but efforts to get beyond the easily named emotion. One of those emotions, or one of those emotional states, was grief. Not the only one. There's lots of celebration. There's other things we'll talk about. But I noticed that both books, in different ways and at different times, interrogate grief, metabolize grief. And so I wondered what you learned about grief and how it travels through the human body, or how it travels through the psyche, or over time, in the process of writing the book, rather than what you knew before you went in. What did you learn about grief?
That's such a beautiful question, and not one that anyone's asked me. So I'm very, very interested to see how I'll answer it, because I think the truth will probably be revealed as I go. I think I went in perhaps thinking of grief as an event, and it was hard not to. I was writing this book at the height of the pandemic. I mean, really, the majority of the poems were written in 2020. And in kind of very quick succession, which is the kind of benefit of writing in moments under duress. It's that, like, you really create a mood and a motif and an atmosphere, and they're all speaking to each other. And also I was like not speaking to anyone else, because no one was doing anything at that time. So I do think in some ways that was particular to the circumstance, and in other ways it sort of made me think of the way that grief shapes us in the long term, but also how it's kind of a refrain. Like, it did become more and more apparent to me that we cannot distinguish or separate what is a wounding from what is wondrous. And there is something very sacred about that. And it's not a glorification of pain, I think, and it's not a sort of toxic fetishizing of it. It's, part of what I was relying on was that the etymology, the supposed etymology of wonder, is from wound, from a sort of an old German cognate that translated to Middle English. So, and so that felt entirely right to me. And then in reflecting, really, even just over the last few years, some of the most ecstatic moments of joy have followed the sort of deepest moments of pain. And I don't think it's that, it's a relative modulation. I actually really think that they are both intrinsically such human experiences that it's very hard. Just as, like the bliss of love carries with it the guarantee of grief and pain. I mean, these things do go hand in hand, and it seems sort of trite to say that. And the effort then becomes, how do you write it in a way that isn't trite and that feels like it's a kind of prism being turned that looks at different angles of the same thing over and over again, without exhausting the reader's capacity to be interested in this,
I'll add that some of the earliest poems in this collection were written during the throes of the height of the AIDS pandemic. And at one point, I found it so hard. I wanted so badly to write about what I was witnessing. What I was also witnessing and living through as a young, queer person, as a young Black gay person. There were a number of writers, really sort of extraordinary writers that I met, who are no longer with us, who were lost to the AIDS pandemic. And so I found myself trying to figure out ways to memorialize them, to capture the moment. And my grief and pain was so extensive that I found myself turning to fixed forms like sonnets, right? I thought, okay, when I was younger, I said, I'm never gonna write a sonnet. That's just, that's so antiquated, right? But I found that was the only way I could contain the pain and the grief. And I remember there was a poem, it's not in this collection, but it was one of the poems that I wrote was to the late writer Melvin Dixon, who's kind of, in many ways, a kind of touchstone for me. He was a poet, he was a fiction writer, he was a translator, he was absolutely brilliant. And I showed it, I think I showed it to Elizabeth Alexander. And so I said, I've got a lot more of these. And she said, poems to Melvin. And I said, no, sonnets, because I think she was like, you're going to write a book of, poems to Melvin Dixon. But but I guess what I was trying to convey to her was that, I had to turn to sonnets. I think one of those sonnets out of the, I mean, I don't know how many actually did make it into the book. Um, but I also think, it took me a while to find the appropriate forms, through which to think through,
Mm.
uh, I mentioned crises earlier, kind of the social, political, cultural, health crises that I've lived through, particularly, the AIDS pandemic, and then when, of course, in the when this book was under, uh, sort of in the editing stage and production stage, of course, we got hit with, the new pandemic, and I felt, and I've said this to people, almost a kind of PTSD.
Mhm.
Um, because I felt like, I'm seeing some of the same things happening again. This terrible government non-response, people dying, people suffering, people dying. Our really inadequate healthcare system, kind of being exposed for, the horror it really is, despite all the things we're kind of constantly told about. It's the best American, everything is the best in the world. And so I thought, okay, maybe this is the appropriate time for this book to appear, because in a sense, there's a kind of mirroring happening. I mean, one thing I'll also say is, and I've said this before, in some recent interviews, one of the last poems in the book, was a poem, that I wanted to write and could not write because, again, I felt like the grief and the pain were so I was so close to them. They were so strong. They were almost overflowing. And that's the poem Pulse, which is a tribute to the victims of the Pulse massacre. And it's one of the last poems of the book. But I think I had reached a point as I was reading through all of the poems that were going to be in the manuscript, at which I was able to say, okay, I actually can step back. I actually can think through how I want to respond to this. And then the lines started to come to me. And as we know as poets, right? When the lines come to you, even if you don't use them, they don't end up in the final poem. You listen to them and you write them down. And so that was my way in, to that poem. And I think it's always been my way. I think into, or one of my ways into, sort of thinking through, grief, and pain, and how to uh, transmute them,
Yeah.
to grapple with them, as works of literature, or in and as works of literature.
And though Pulse isn't a fixed form, it relies on anaphora. This, for anyone who's lucky enough to have the book in front of them, this is page 195. It begins with "We are, we are, we are," and there's something about that anaphora that feels both like an indicator of control over the type, but also an effort to get a handle on something that's incalculable and to be approached in any strong way. I noticed also that you have an abecedarian or an abecedarian, I don't know how to say it, in the poem. And I find that such an interesting one. I had a student last year who we were doing abecedarians as one option in a formal exercise, and she cut out a few letters and said, well, those letters were too hard. And I said, well, let me tell you the history of the abecedarian as a Hebrew prayer. And, that there's some submission to form that brings, almost like meditation, that brings new wisdom in, sort of turning oneself over to the form. So I found that in this book too, very much, like, let me enter this room and see what it might yield, et cetera. Thinking about the stanza, of course, as a room. So I was wondering, John, if you might read a poem that doesn't necessarily explicitly fit the category of form, but that does grapple with this intersection between loss and how one gets up the next day in the morning. And that is the poem, "The Soul is Always Beautiful," on page 89. If you would grace us with that poem, if you wouldn't mind, I'd be so grateful.
Gladly. The soul is always beautiful. When night hovers in the square, moon sheets the avenues and glare from headlights glazes the lone chestnut. Murmurs linger after the blue frost in subdivisions, arriving in crates like tangerines from the ghost orchards of Chile. Beauty is especially dangerous under pressure. To feel your lips on my throat like a wire or a beretta firing slowly underwater. Remember What I cannot bear, the leaving, lost hours, the embarrassed fragrance of surrender, like a midnight novena or November firs still standing on the naked slopes after dynamite shears away bedrock and rangers sweep over brush, searching for missed embers and clues. Whatever you find there, pocket for yourself. Keep the lock of my hair, sulfur tang of my skin still burning on your tongue, a signal fire. Black as your fingers on a compass, I turn on, never ceasing to ponder the strange economy of ladders or break dancers, men's eyes when they lie writhing like dolphins through a narrow strait out into the broad way of a bay, the sound of phosphorus as it catches fire, which is the soul rising into air without fear. Your eyes are dawn opening. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like it's a very compressed howl. It takes us there very quickly, but it's a beautiful poem. I feel like that's one of the ones to pin on the wall, as a fellow poet. Well, if you don't mind, I wanted to turn the corner just a little bit and talk about poetry as a alternative historical record, which I think comes up most explicitly and has been covered in a lot of the reviews of your book, John, but I think also applies to your book, Maya, even in terms of, if you don't mind my mentioning a theme an anecdotal reference that runs through both American Faith and Wound is the Origin of Wonder, which is the loss of a friend at a very young age. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit, not just to start out when talking about how your books might serve as an alternative historical record, and if you had that in your mind, but also what other poets bring that, serve that function for you. Who do you turn to look for an alternative historical record?
So interesting. So the first question, well, I actually don't know what order they're in now, but in any case, American Faith was looking very much at public and private violence, and it was a topic that, my parents are Romanian refugees. They came here, I was born right after they arrived in the country, under really, under duress, essentially. So I've always been very interested in I suppose the political temperature and political rhetoric. I think it was something that they paid a great deal of attention to. I grew up in a trilingual household, and so it was. It's always something that's, I think, been in the back of my mind, or my rhetoric, or my kind of world building. But I did very kind of deliberately want to get away from that for my second collection, partially because I felt so exhausted by the 2016, 2018 stretch of years. It really felt like we had hit a kind of basement, and then the pandemic happened and we found a sub basement. So it was, in terms of poetry being a historical record, I do certainly believe, and I love that saying, like, it's impossible to get the news from poetry, but people die every day for lack of what is found there, right? So I do firmly stand on the side of that. And yet, when I was working on Wound, I mean, there's one long poem that talks about the pandemic and the experience of the pandemic in New York City. And I did broach that very carefully because I was aware I didn't want to write poems about American violence. I felt I was doing a lot of that in my first collection. I mean, the book was called American Faith for that reason. I really wanted to say, as someone who was born in this country but otherwise has no roots to this country, like, this is my experience of this. And of course, to be born here means my roots are here, but I also, my entire family's in Romania. The whole thing felt sort of like I was both participating in this and a sort of an outsider as well. And the pandemic felt so close to all of us that what I didn't feel like doing was making a record of necessarily like, we are wearing masks, we are doing this, it is so weird to be on Zoom. There are many poets who did a brilliant job of that. I wanted to talk about a really particular kind of anxiety I had very early in the pandemic. I mean, really in the first month or two, I thought, I understand that the world is going to go back to normal, and very optimistically, I thought it would happen soon. And I don't think I'm going to be normal. What happens if I can't readjust into a sensation of joy, normality? It felt so wounding. It felt so disorienting. And of course, then it didn't go back to normal and things got worse and worse. But at that point, we didn't quite know, right? And it sounds like a kind of silly thing to say we didn't know. I mean, there's so many phases in this where we didn't know, but I didn't even know what I didn't know yet. So I felt that that's what I wanted to record, the sensation of waking up day after day and not even knowing what exactly to hope for, because it was so, the movie reel was kind of unfolding as we went. So to answer the second part of that in terms of who I look to, you know, I think there are two sensibilities. I mean, I'm very interested in like Akhmatova and reading sort of Soviet and Russian and Romanian poets. That's certainly part of my tradition, but more in terms of an affinity and what I like, I'm also very interested in kind of more subtle records. I love the English poet Edward Thomas. I'm very interested in the Romantic poets and a record of a kind of a greenness and of an earthiness, and that sort of turn to industrialization that was the point of no return that we are now living through and kind of making quantum leaps in. So that's a period I'm always very interested in. I'm very interested in reading poets who are reacting and saying things like, whoa, slow down, this is getting out of control. And in fact, it's like 19th century poets saying that. And I'm sure poets have been saying that at every turn, right? Like maybe we're going in a bad direction here, folks. But there's something particularly poignant to me about that period. So, you know, I read a lot of nature poets. I think in my heart of hearts, I feel like a nature poet, even though I don't think that's what others would qualify me as. And so those are the sorts of records I'm very interested in.
Before we move to you, John, I wanted to say one thing and then maybe ask you to read a related poem, Maya. First of all, if memory serves, I think it was Edward Thomas that Robert Frost wrote The Road Not Taken for.
Yes, so Edward Thomas and Frost were, yes, exactly. I think that's true.
And he was sort of making fun of what Frost saw as Thomas's indecision. Excuse me, he would fret over a choice, and then once he made a choice, he would obsess about the option he hadn't taken, etc. But in retrospect, it might have been a kind of wisdom on Thomas's part, you know, to
certainly. And I mean, he's such a delicate poet, and he's not someone I think widely read here, but he is. And then died very young in war, essentially. So it's a very kind of interesting, but I think that's very funny. Yes, exactly. That's just an interesting fun fact.
Well, I wondered if you might read, since it's so on topic, they are building a hospital, which, if memory serves, is on page 70, before we turn to John, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, of course. And it's, you know, one of the poems that most directly addresses the crisis. And I live in Manhattan where, and I'm not really a city person, which I think sometimes surprises people. I would much rather be like in the middle of woods if I could all the time, but I can't for many reasons, including work. Unless someone wants to hire me and relocate me to the middle of a wood. I don't know what purpose I would serve. I have no skills, but I can do this, read poems. But I'm very blessed to live very close to Central Park, in fact, across the street. And the park exactly where I was situated became the field hospital. So in essence, you know, I would, the short walks I could take, I stopped taking because I would have to see these large tents and immediately burst into tears. I mean, the whole field was razed and turned into essentially like, it's sort of like, it's so, even to this day, I sometimes say this, I think we've all kind of moved on too quickly. Like this is, I do, to your point of trauma, John, think that there's an inherent trauma that we're all kind of ignoring and kind of pushing through. And I remember when we got the vaccine, people were saying, oh, it's like hot girl summer, everyone's going to revive, et cetera, et cetera. And we are ignoring the psychic conditions of what it means to have meat coolers parked outside hospitals, right? To see this, to see the absolute, I mean, it's just, anyway, so that's my soapbox moment about that. Just everyone on this, be kind to yourselves. And if you don't feel okay, that's okay, right? We PhD students will be studying this moment for the next 100 years, right? They're building a hospital on the field outside my home, a field hospital in an actual field, the great American oak on one end, the Tupelo on the other. They have laid white tarp over the boggy grass. and raised a series of insulated tents. It has blossomed overnight like a dark circus. Machines to dehumidify the air, cots like dollhouse furniture, and intricate machines to keep alive those whose bodies are resigned to leaving. An orchestra of discipline and calculated faith, of power cords and outlets maneuvered around trees, of hoping rain holds and spring reads the room. The human beings are desperate. They've built a hospital where in other days I walked my dog, counting no blessing but the one I chased, who startled strangers on blankets before stretching on the grass. How happy I was not knowing how happy, walking the path along the field's perimeter, watching the sky flare its oranges and pinks reflect a cool purple off the leaves, idling in goodness, letting the mind loose over the life let it. I thought forever, did not think, for so much of gladness was thoughtlessness. Now I mourn the hours from the safety of my health, stand a little lost at what succeeds the morning. They are building a hospital. The whir of engines stirs the animals, a melody, a dirge the robins sing.
Thank you so much, Maya. John, there are so many ways in which people have pointed to punks as an alternative historical record. I'm so curious to know what you think about this question.
So I would say that I think in many different ways, my work from the beginning has grappled with history. My very first book, Annotations, which sort of straddles the line between poetry, fiction, and memoir, uh, is a kind of like mini autobiography, mini memoir, but also not just of my own life, but also of the region I'm from, the city I'm from, St. Louis, and the region I'm from, the Midwest, so Missouri and the Midwest. And my second book, Seismosis, was much more abstract. So it's kind of, if you think about zooming out and zooming in, and then the book of stories and novellas, counter narratives, really was an attempt to think through a kind of series of counter histories, counter stories of the Americas, of America, of the Americas, of the United States, to kind of challenge our sort of understanding of a certain way of thinking about exceptionalism. And this country, all its country's history is sort of divorced from everything, every other country around it. It's our colonial history, both going backwards and forward. So anyway, so in a sense, history always plays a role in my work, and I feel like again, I was sort of thinking about this movement between the personal and the very sort of kind of public, the larger kind of the larger canvas. You get that in punks because there are poems, of course, that are very much historically situated at particular moments, and so they do kind of give a personal, but I won't say a sort of alternative history of what was happening at a given time. But then there are also poems that are about historical figures like Alain Locke and Jackie Robinson and George Washington Carver and Miles Davis and Bessie Smith, etc. So I feel like the book offers different ways into addressing I think the wonderful question that you've asked. And one thing I would say is I was thinking about this just with Alain Locke. I have Jeffrey Stewart. I think Jeffrey Stewart is the scholar. That extraordinary biography he wrote of Alain Locke, which is, I think, I want to say 800 pages. It's big. It's a, this really big magisterial biography of a person who, he coined. I think he was one who coined the phrase "the new Negro." He was really the philosopher of the Harlem Renaissance. And he's also someone who's been pretty much not really attended to in terms of his philosophical work and his thought, right? but he played this really kind of key role. And so Stewart has this huge and beautiful, and as I said, magisterial biography, which won, I think, some major awards. And I have a poem, right? And I thought, how can you distill a life and thought and spirit into a lyric poem? And so one of the things I was trying to do. And so it got me to think about what it is that poetry uniquely can do in terms of its power of distillation, its power of, as I was saying earlier, getting at the essence of things, in part through the way that we as writers, we as poets, put words together on the page, right? The forms we devise. So anyway, I would say yes. I think my book offers, this book and all my work offers different ways of thinking about the historical and how form and genre play a role in helping us understand what happened, and sort of I hope we see and rethink, right, what happened. In terms of writers I turn to, I mean, there's so many. I was thinking one of the books that really kind of contains that, like just such an extraordinary range of people. And I'm going to give a shout out to this book because I think it's really quite extraordinary. Is the the book African American Poetry: 250 Years of Struggle and Song, a Library of America anthology. It's a really 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 amazing anthology, a collection, and it goes pretty much all the way back to Phyllis Wheatley, and I want to say Lucy. I can't remember if Lucy Terry's in there, but I think Lucy Terry's in there. Some of the earliest American poets and African American poets, and women poets, all the way up to, I think, today. And again and again and again, you see, even when people are not directly addressing history, they are attending to what I think Audre Lorde said when she was writing poetry is not a luxury. And she was speaking specifically about Black women poets and the role that poetry plays in helping us understand the world. But I think one of the things we see again and again is how the poets are using poems to kind of define the world, redefine the world, really truly see the world and show the world for what it is in ways, and almost kind of breaking open, even when we have those moments when it was really kind of a fraught thing to do, to write at all, right? To be a Black person, be a woman, and Black woman, and write at all, be a queer person. So I think that's just one book, but I mean, there's so many points. We only have so much time, and I could go down the list. But that's one.
I know, time is flying. But I had two thoughts to that point. This summer, I heard John Murillo respond to an audience question. The question was, what do you like most about your work? A hard question for poets to answer. And he paused and said, I like that it exists.
Right.
I value that it exists at all, and I think there's something to be said for that. In terms of this historical record, I had two passages from you, John, that I just wanted to sort of mention that I feel like speak to both collections. And then I really want to remind everyone who's watching to not be shy about putting comments in the comment box or asking questions, posing your own questions of our illustrious guests here. I'm sure they would love to hear your questions as well. But first, in your poem Night Tea, on page 31, for anyone following along, there are these lines at the very end of the poem, what was not said comes back. And I think there's this effort in both books to record and make space for all of the stuff that doesn't make its own record in language. I sometimes say, that anticipation doesn't get enough space. If you're worried about a diagnosis that you're going to get at the end of the week, you spend that week in the negative anticipation or the fear of what's going to come. And so if you get the relief of a good diagnosis, or the relief of a non-diagnosis, where have you been all week? Have you been in what the newspaper is covering, or have you been somewhere else? So that's one that I thought was really, really important. You also later have, as the epigraph to one of the later sections, an epigraph from Colombian novelist Jaime Manrique, who says, I remember, ergo I live. And I thought that was another way in which, in fact, both of your books take up the mantle of remembering and alluding and, kind of sustaining the life of something or someone that might not otherwise be made reference to or be celebrated. So I wanted to thank you both for that. I'm just going to check and see any questions people have. Feel free to send them over. Did either of you want to follow up on that? I had another craft related question. Oh, okay. We've got a question here from Jenna Blum. I'd love to know who each poet's favorite poets are. Favorite, so hard, but what do you think?
Do you have that locked and loaded? It's always a tricky one.
Yeah. Oh my God. I mean, I could just go down the list. So I was telling someone the other day that if one of the poets I would love, whose work I would love to take to an island with me. I could only take so many books, and one of the people who I find inexhaustible is the great poet Jay Wright. Let's see. I mean, there's so many. Robert Hayden. I mentioned Audre Lorde. I love Audre Lorde's poetry. We could even say just entire schools. I mean, when I was younger, I used to really love, and still, the Black Mountain School, some of the beat poets. I can think of specific poems. Many of the great Black arts poets. I mean, Amir Baraka, is one of those poets who I return to again and again when he's at his best. Nikki Giovanni, when I was a child, was just really one of the most important poets to me. Meme Bursenberger was I took a class with Ishmael Reed, another great poet, and he took us to a class to hear Meme Bursenberger. And I remember going to hear, just sort of encountering her work, and I'd never heard anything like it, and that sort of rocked my world. I mean, we could just go down the list. There are so many extraordinary poets out there. Patricia Spears Jones, Erica Hunt, Dawn Lundy Martin, Ronaldo Wilson. I mean, yes, so you could just go down the list. Yes,
I'm reading list, by the way. This is like reading list for the rest of our lives.
Yes, exactly.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love that list, John, and so many I share with you who are amazing. I'm going to try to think of people that you haven't necessarily mentioned. And in terms of contemporary poets, for me, the English poet Alice Oswald is super, super important, and someone whose work I've been following for 15 years or whatever. I really absolutely adore her work. Robin Costa Lewis, an amazing contemporary poet. Jenny Shia, another poet I absolutely adore. I'm really trying now not to step on Tracy K. Smith, amazing, also at Form, that I really just amazed consistently by her. And sort of past people, my first deep love. Oh, I was Jory Graham as well, also super, super important to me. And first loves Zora Manley Hopkins. I absolutely love devotional poetry. I think Hopkins, in terms of sound sense, just brilliance. Dickinson, and then Thomas Hardy, Wordsworth, Keats from the Romantics, and then the British poet Philip Larkin has been an incredibly important influence of mine.
Yeah, and the poem I read earlier, of course, it cites Whitman, and of course, it's clearly influenced by John Ashbery in the New York School.
Static in that way, yeah.
And also, a little bit of Langston Hughes and the Harlem Renaissance poets. I mean, so I could just, we could just keep going. I mean, I try to read as widely as possible, and I have to say I'm always lifted by poets, even poets that I had not read before. And there's a poem by Morgan Parker that I go back to again. I mean, I could just go down the list of the poets, some of the poets who are just starting out, and poets who've been writing for years. And then then sometimes you think, okay, I've been writing in a certain way, let me read a poet, like a poet like who wrote those extraordinary persona poems. And it's like, okay, I can learn from this, but also I takes me to another place. So I mean, they just could keep going like that.
I would like to get those reading lists. By the way, maybe you both would make an extended list on Twitter later. People can follow you if they want to. I'll put your handles in the chat if people want to come find you, because I'm sure we'd all love to know. But we'll also capture, I know someone from A Mighty Blaze is going to be capturing a lot of those recommendations. I see that there's a question about how you both got started and what your advice is to new poets. I wanted to pair it with one final question for both of you. Maybe you could give a brief response to this final question, since sadly we're almost out of time, and then we'll end with a poem by John. But tying together this question about how you got started and what your advice is to new poets, I wanted to ask you about one moment or one line or one puzzle from the recent book that you really labored over. Something where you felt like, I don't know how to do this, I don't know how to say this, I keep getting it wrong, and you really sort of troubled a line, if there was one like that. Maybe I'm projecting because that happens with me, and I thought it would be really generative for us to hear that, especially for emerging writers, to hear about a line or a moment that you struggled over and how you resolved it in the book. And then if you have any other advice for new poets. Do you have anything in mind off the top of your head, Maya? You seem like you were nodding.
Yeah. So the end of a poem called what I always think is actually one of the happiest and most hopeful poems. And I will also say that I don't think this is an unhappy book. I mean, it's sort of interesting that, like, again, I think the opportunities of grief, or the opportunities that pain present to us, I think have to be part of the conversation. They cannot be purely negative things, because they're just the reality, like they are what is part of our lives. So I feel that in this poem, All That Is Made, I was talking about a figure I love, Julian of Norwich, and her sort of famous phrase that Eliot lifted for the four quartets, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, used to be the end of that poem. There was some evocation to it. I think it ended, this is the world, it is well, so long as it be. So I just wanted to say something like that. And it didn't sound right, and it almost felt like I was reaching so much for this thing that people recognize Julian of Norwich for, that it came close to that Keats thing, the too palpable a design upon the reader. I was like force feeding the reader her one sort of famous phrase, instead of just allowing the poem to end on the idea of the hazelnut, of Christ opening his palm and showing her a hazelnut, and saying, this is, you're sweating all this stuff, this is it, this is the whole world, this is what you're worried about, and I loved that recontextualizing. And so in the end, someone said, why don't you just cut that, and how small and round our suffering, and assume that the reader will understand what you're saying, and I think that's also part of the advice for all poets. When something's not working, it might be a question of killing your darlings. Like, you may have gone in with too firm and fixed an idea of how you want this poem to end, and by now it's outwitted you, right? And you have to forfeit that piece. It no longer fits the poem. And sometimes the sooner we can allow our egos to do that, the faster we get to the real luminosity beneath, to the next draft. And yes, was that the whole question? I can't remember with their first part.
I think that's a rich meal. And I love that final line, how small and round our suffering, because it feels, rather than reductive, like a sort of miniature perfection that we all are afforded. So thank you so much. How about you, John?
Yeah, so I'll just say another poet I could mention is Ed Roberson, another just extraordinary poet who was also a colleague of mine. And Ed used to send, I think he still does, but he used to be on the list where he would send out his poem. So I sent him a poem that actually appears in here called Underground. It was a much earlier version of it. And eventually that earlier version got published. And Ed was really gentle. I sent him that poem and a poem called Suit. And he said, I think Suit is fine. But he said, something's a little off, in a very gentle way, like a little off and Underground. And I was just so wedded to it. And then when I went back and read it, I thought, he's right. This, it's just, I'm totally on the surface. I need to go much, much deeper with this poem. I've got to go deeper. And that's what I ended up doing. It's going much, much deeper. Another poet who I did mention, but I love her first book, Tanya Foster. Tanya does these really extraordinarily powerful things just with how language, words themselves, the sounds of words turning and breaking. And And I thought, going into the words themselves and then kind of pulling out and thinking, okay, what is the effect that you want to have with this poem? What is this poem trying to do? And allowing myself not to try and force it, but to say, let the poem tell the the kind of the it's not even so much a story, but let the poem present the world in the way that only this poem can do it. So that was a kind of revelation. And once I was able to do that, I was able to actually kind of crack open how to rewrite the poem. And it really is, in some ways, you get kind of traces of that earlier version, but this is the version I think that actually works.
I really appreciate that idea of too how sometimes we get really connected to the denotative meaning of a word and not just to its plain sound, the
Right.
thud or the slide it makes, on the tongue and stuff like that. So thank you for reminding us to listen to the music as we go.
And of
Uh,
course, you think about just pardon me for just interrupting. I was just saying that the sort of polysemous power of words is something that, I mean, I think poets are attentive to it, but often in everyday speech, in everyday discourse, we lose sight of that, right? And this is part of the magic of language, right? Good and bad, right? But poets, I think, know how to make the most of it, or try to know how to make the most of it. So that's one of the things I think, for young poets is to follow what Maya is saying, is to be willing to kill your darlings, and also you know don't give up. Just keep pushing, keep going, keep reading, keep writing, and learn. You learn from what doesn't work.
Well, I have to thank you both so much. I want to remind everyone to go out and get these books. I had hoped to earmark time for one of John's most amazing and electric poems, Blackened. In light of how short on time we are, I wondered, and how up the conversation is right now, I wondered if you might be willing to take us out with your beautiful poem, Beatitude, which
Okay.
I just feel like will carry us all through whatever's coming, if you would be willing to.
And
Okay.
thank you, Allison, so much for this.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
We'll,
you.
we'll,
Thank you, Maya.
we'll chat briefly again right after John's poem, but
Okay, wasn't sure.
Beatitude. Love everything. Love the sky and sea, trees and rivers, mountains and abysses. Love animals, and not just because you are one. Love your parents and your children, even if you have none. Love your spouse or partner, no matter what either word means to you. Love until you create a cavern in your loving, until it seethes like a volcano. Love every time. Love your enemies. Love the enemies of your enemies. Love those whose very idea of love is hate. Love the liars and the fakes. Love the tattletales and the cowards. Love the hypocrites and hypocrites, the hucksters and the traitors. Love the thieves, because everyone has thought of stealing something at least once. Love the rich who live only to empty your purse or wallet. Love the poverty of your empty coin purse or wallet. Love your piss and sweat and shit. Love your and others' chatter, and it's proof of the expansiveness of nothingness. Love your shadows and their silent censure. Love your fears, yesterdays and tomorrows. Love your yesterdays and tomorrows. Love your beginning and your end. Love the fact that your end is another beginning, or could be for someone else. Love yourself, but not too much that you cannot love everything and everyone else. Love everywhere. Love in the absence of love. Love the monsters breeding in every corner of every city and suburb, all throughout the soil of the countryside. Love the monster breeding inside you and slaughter him with love. Love the shipwreck of your body, your mind's salted garden. Love, love.
whew. Thank you for that gift.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you.
I want to thank both of you so deeply. I'm so excited, and I have to tell everyone again, please go out and read these books, support these amazing poets, and do yourselves a favor and enrich your lives with these beautiful poems. Both books are so fantastic. I want to thank Maya and John so much for making time to spend this hour with all of us. I want to thank our fanner here at A Mighty Blaze, Bo, who's backstage linking everything in the chat. A reminder that there are links to the books and to other events and things that John and Maya have coming up. And I want to remind everyone that we'll have another event next month for Poets in Conversation, our third year. So thank you again, Maya and John.
Thank you.
Allison, so
Thank you,
much.
Allison. It's wonderful. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, John. A pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next month at Poets in Conversation here at A Mighty Blaze. Take care.